Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1240, 1240, September the 14th, 2020, Monday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so it's good to be back from vacation. Hopefully you all were able to survive a few days without TowerGate videos. I'm sure you did just fine. Of course, over the period of time that I was gone, there were a few things that came out, so I'm going to cover a couple of those that I thought were the most important. Probably can't get to everything today, but I'll get to the ones I thought were the most important, at least from my perspective, during the time that I was on vacation. So let's go ahead and get started there. So the first thing that caught my eye was just a couple of days after I left. In fact, I had just gotten down to Florida. I think it was a day after I got down to Florida. Paul Sperry tweeted out the following tweet, quote, "Investigators have learned that the Obama CIA Director John Brennan ran a secret task force out of Langley with its own separate budget to investigate the Trump campaign and allegedly ties to Russia. The task force was set up before the FBI officially launched its own probe July 31st of 2016. Okay, so for those of you who've been following my channel for a long time, you know that this is something that we talked about a long time ago. In fact, in the spring of 2017. This is not new news. I'm surprised. I would assume that Paul Sperry would have known this. But, you know, it's okay. He's 2 or 3 years behind, but that's all right. If you want to actually see the on my timeline, you can simply go over to my timeline and you will see of course, everything's in there by date. You'll see, you only have to scroll down, you know, a little bit because that's very early on. You'll scroll down and you'll see 2 entries there from the end of March and early April of 2017. Let me read the first one for you, right off of my timeline, word for word. Spring of 2017. I'm sorry, spring of 2016. 2016, not 2017, 2016. Spring of 2016. Paul Wood of the BBC reports that John Brennan began organizing the 6-agency task force in the early spring of 2016, no later than March of 2016. So the article by Paul Wood came out in early 2017. I believe it was February or March when he wrote that article telling us that Brennan set up the 6-agency task force in the early spring of 2016, no later than March 2016. That was the first we heard of it. That was the first story that broke on this by Paul Wood of the BBC. It's right there on my timeline. He wrote the story in February or March of 2017 telling us about the 6-agency task force that was set up by Brennan in early spring of 2016. So he wrote the story about a year after the event occurred. Now, just below that, you'll see another story, another entry on my timeline that also relates to that. And what that was is that several months after Paul Wood wrote this article about this multi-agency task force set up by Brennan, Jeff Carlson did a deep dive into that to fact check it and see what more he could learn. And at that time, it was before he was writing for the Epic Times. At that time, he was still, this appeared first on Market's Watch, or the Market's Work, I'm sorry. The Market's Work, which was where Jeff Carlson used to write before he went over to Epic Times. Now, Jeff Carlson did a deeper dive and produced even more information. So Carlson writes, CIA Director John Brennan begins putting together a secret 6-agency task force to focus on the Trump-Russia connections. Clapper and Strzok are part of the task force. Agency heads from the DOJ NSD, the National Security Division, the FBI NSB, the National Security Branch, the NSA, Treasury, and the Department of Defense are included. Cloak and dagger operations began under Brennan's secret task force that was being run out of Langley, CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And it was that story, following the Paul Wood story, where really made my ears perk up, because if you remember going back to that time, it's been a long time, over 2 years. If you remember, the thing that jumped out at me at that time was, wait a minute, we have the DOJ NSD, the FBI NSB, the NSA, the Treasury, and the DOD. What's missing? What would be probably the single most important agency next to the FBI or CIA that would certainly want to be included into that group? Well, that would of course be the State Department. But as you can see here, the State Department was not part of the multi-agency task force, which led me to think about that and ruminate on that for a couple of days, and I finally figured out why. And the reason why that the State Department was left out was because they had to leave the State Department out to keep them kind of in the dark, because they were going to use the State Department as the pipeline. So they needed to keep them out of the loop, because the State Department was going to be used as the pipeline to pipeline the fake information through them. So that's why you don't see the State Department appear in the multi-agency task force. Now, the reason, again, that this is important is because for the longest time, even up to this present day, the FBI continues to say that they didn't do anything in this investigation until July 31st of 2016. But we know that contacts with Flynn, Papadopoulos, and Carter Page all occurred back in the early spring of 2016, 5-6 months before the investigation across the hurricane was open. So we know that there were things going on and things happening before that date. And of course we can go back to 2015 with the NSA contractors. So there were lots of things happening before July 31st, October 2016. And so I determined that, well, now we know now we know who it was that was involved in all these things that were going on before July 31st of 2016. It was things that were going on as a result of this multi-agency task force, which also, which is not really looked at here, but we found out, months and months later as we did more research on this, that this also involved the use of foreign people. Because remember, you have in this group the DOD, Department of Defense, and the Office of Net Assessment falls under them, and that's who Halpert was working for. As far as who Azra Turk was working for, and any of those other people over in Cambridge, we're not really sure. But they're all involved, and the activities that they were involved in would have likely been the activities that were being generated from the multi-agency or six-agency task force. So that's why it's so critical. Now, again, I have to assume that this has been public knowledge for 3 years now, so I was a little surprised that Paul Sperry would tweet this out as if it was some new revelation. We've known about this for a very long time, and I have to assume that Durham, in the course of his investigation, could not possibly have overlooked this. Because we had Attorney General Barr, we've seen him on TV a couple times, talking about the fact that, yeah, well, they said they opened the investigation July 31st, 2016, Operation Crossfire Hurricane, but we know that there were other things going on prior to that. So clearly, Durham would have been looking into that, trying to find, okay, yeah, we know there were things going on. What was going on? We know a lot about it now. And who would have been directing all this? Where was it coming from? Well, it was coming from the multi-agency task force, or six-agency task force, set up by Mr. Potato Head, which, of course, incorporated the use of foreign spies, the Oconus lures, and all that sort of thing. Keep in mind that both Clapper and Peters Ben Strzok and us were on that multi-agency task force. And I have to assume that Halper would have been on there as well, but it probably includes people like maybe Downer and Mifsud as well. And if I wanted to get to the bottom of Mifsud, which you must do, then people involved in this multi-agency task force would be people I would be talking to, because they can probably tell you who put Mifsud into the game. So that is my thoughts on the Paul Sperry tweet. Yes, it is an important piece of information. I was just a little surprised that Paul Sperry seems to think it's new news. And I can't imagine in my wildest nightmares that the Durham investigation has not thoroughly vetted this multi-agency task force. And of course we know that later on in the summer, sometime after August, after Brennan briefs Harry Reid, he set up another sort of compartment of this multi-agency task force within Obama's group of insiders within the Obama administration itself, which would have included Susan Rice and Newland and people like that. So that Brennan was running this multi-agency task force on this hand, and then he has another task force which involves White House people, Obama and his people, and probably some CIA people, some FBI people, DOJ, National Security Branch people. So it eventually morphed itself into a second task force, and Brennan would have been in the middle of both of them. So hopefully Durham has, and his investigators have looked into this a long time ago, because that's, if you want to find out about all the activities that were going on before July 31st, 2016, activities where they were making contact with Sam Clovis, Papadopoulos, Carter Page, Michael Flynn. All these operations were likely being run under this multi-agency task force, which included, of course, this DOJ, this Pentagon Office, Department of Defense, Office of Net Assessments, which is where Halper was running out of. And Halper, of course, would have been the person who would have been, I wouldn't say running, but certainly sort of one of the people involved in the overseas operations. And I think that the Misfit Downer, the Cambridge 4, Dearlove, and all these guys would have been a part of this. So I think all of that falls under the multi-agency task force. They generated the fake information, and then they pipelined it through the State Department, and that set the stage for the FBI to begin a domestic investigation, because the CIA couldn't do that, which is why Brennan had to go through all this. So that is what to me seems very obvious, and I will be very surprised if after Durham finishes investigation, if we don't learn a lot more about this multi-agency task force and the key role that they played by being the provocateurs, the ones who generated all the fake stuff that would later be used to justify what would look like a legal investigation. So I think that that's basically the nuts and bolts of it, and we'll have to wait and see what Durham finds out about it. And I would be absolutely shocked and amazed if, in fact, we don't learn a lot more about that and find out that Durham's his team would have had to have known about this a long time ago. This is not new information, in other words. Now, let's get on to the next thing that came up, which was this resignation of one of Durham's lead investigators, this woman, Nora Dennehy, who, of course, we know is a Democrat and is not a supporter of Trump. Obviously, she's a Northeastern liberal, probably a big Hillary fan. And, of course, we get this story. And the original story, was written by the local paper in Connecticut. The Hartford Courant actually broke this story. Many other national news sites, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, piggybacked on this and wrote their own stories based on information from this original story, which the original story was the Hartford Courant. Now, the story suggests, this original story, which everyone's piggybacked off from, suggests that Nora Dennehy was leaving the Durham investigation because of concerns that the investigation team was being pressured for political reasons to produce a report before the work was done. Supposedly a colleague is the source of that. A colleague is the source. Well, is that true? I don't know. I'd say it could be true, it could be false. Again, whenever you get, colleague said, or unanimous source, or government official, when you can't go on the record with someone, you simply can't believe a news story anymore. I no longer, cite these news stories and believe them until they actually give me a source. If no one's willing to step forward and put their name forward, I come on and do videos here every day, right along with many other YouTubers. You know who we are. You know our names. Anyone who wanted to find out anything about us, it's not hard to do. We're not hiding from anything. We come out and say who we are. I don't have a fake name, or a fake address, or anything else. Everything I do is completely out in the open, just like many other YouTubers. We just report what we read, and I tell you who my sources are. I certainly make an effort. Sometimes I may forget, but for the most part, or else it's a story that everybody is. There's 1,000 sources, and so take your pick. But for the most part, I tell you where the information comes from, and so again, I don't put a lot of credibility into anything unless the source can be verified. And here, the only source we have of this is colleague said. What colleague? Okay, so anyway, now let's just assume for a minute that it's true. Well, to me, that's a good thing because it tells me that that Barr is applying the pressure and saying, "Hey, let's go. You've been on this thing for a year and a half. It's time to slap the handcuffs on some people. We need, before this election takes place in 2020, the American people need to know what happened in the last election. It's critically important." And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to wrap up your entire investigation, but we need at least some sort of a statement from the Department of Justice to let the voters know before they vote again what happened last time. It's critically important. And it's high time that we slap the cuffs on some of these people who we know are guilty. So, I don't see this as a bad thing. I think that there's probably, just like in most cases, it's not just one thing. It's probably a lot of things. And there's a lot of background information which various people have commented on, who, like Shipwrecked Crew and other people like that, who actually have been DOJ officials, attorneys, who've worked these cases and knows how these things work. And there's other information out there that should be taken into consideration. First of all, when Durham selected Dennehy in the first case because he had worked with her on several very high-profile public corruption cases, both involving Republicans and Democrats. Clearly, Durham trusts Dennehy, and he knows her, I don't, but he worked with her for over 20 years. And he trusted her enough, even though she's a Democrat, and he obviously knows that, he's a Republican. But he trusted her enough to put her into that position. If he didn't trust her, he wouldn't have put her into that position. So I think that you have to give him the benefit of the doubt here. Now, she was first told when she joined Durham's team that it'd only be a 6 to 12 month assignment, but it's now turned into more like at this point, about 17, 18 month assignment. So it's way over where she originally was brought in, time-wise. Let's also keep in mind that she had left the Department of Justice after 19 years and went to work for a private defense contractor, where she was making probably 3 to 5 times what she was making at the DOJ. Now, it was obvious that if she'd have stayed one more year, she would have got her pension and all the other government benefits. But obviously, the opportunity came along, and she looked at the money factor as one factor, certainly, probably others, and said, "Hey, I can make 3 to 5 times what I'm making now, taking this job with this defense contractor," knowing good and well that at any time before she retires, she could go back to the DOJ very easily, put in another year, and qualify for her 20-year retirement benefits. So it was probably a personal financial decision she made at that time. She had an opportunity. She jumped on it. I probably would have done the same. 3 to 5 times. If someone offered me a job making 3 to 5 times what I'm making now, and there were other terms and conditions about it that appealed to me, I would take the job, knowing good and well I could always jump back at the DOJ and put in one more year and get those benefits. So if they were necessary at that point, she'd probably make so much money working for the defense contractor, she wouldn't care. And she was a relatively young woman at that time. She's probably about 58 or 59 as we speak today. So we learned that Durham put her in that position because he needed someone down in D.C. to perform a very, very important role. First of all, he needed someone who had a high enough clearance to be able to access all the documents he would need. And Dennehy possesses that type of clearance. So that's why she was sent down to D.C. Also, she was sent there to be the filter, because I don't have time to get into it, but as Shipwrecked Crew explains, you have to be careful about the evidence that you're collecting, because you could run into issues in court with certain types of evidence. So certain types of evidence has to be filtered out so that none of the investigators ever even see it, including Durham. So he trusted her enough, Dennehy, to send her down there to be the filter, to filter out the, number one, her clearance would allow her to get everything Durham and his team wanted, but she would also have the responsibility of making sure to filter out the things that they would not be able to see because it could compromise their case. Also, keep in mind, it's possible that Dennehy has now reached the end of her part of the investigation. She is not the person who's going to go into court and do the actual trials. She was involved in getting the information, filtering the information. She's been involved in the questioning of some witnesses based on the information she's gotten. But she is not in this capacity, in this investigation, she is not going to serve or function as a trial attorney. So it's very likely that she left because the work that she was hired to do has now been accomplished. And now the investigation's moved away from that. They've gotten all the information they're going to get as far as classified information is concerned from documents or what have you. And now there's really nothing left for her to do anymore. And so now she's done. Now the investigation will move into another phase, which really doesn't involve her. So it's very possible that that is what has happened. The fact is, though, it could be any of these things or all of these things, and we don't know. But it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But I can tell you that we do know she's a Democrat. And if I were her, I would not want to be on the Durham team when he starts dropping indictments and putting out some sort of report or something that reflects very badly on Democrats. She probably doesn't want to be a part of that because it could draw a lot of heat on her, and she probably doesn't want that. So I think she probably had a lot of reasons, and that would probably be one of them. She probably wants to vacate before the shit hits the fan, because she doesn't want her name on that list of prosecutors who are, taking down people like Comey and Strzok and all these people. And certainly this is going to reflect badly on Democrats, which would reflect badly on her. So I think there was a lot of reasons, and I think that this is probably one, the politics of it. And of course, she's watching what's happening now with Black Lives Matter and Antifa going to people's homes, targeting people. She doesn't want to be targeted. She wants to slip out the back door very quietly and hope that she doesn't end up being a target once they bring charges against some of these people, and paint a picture that puts the Democrats in a very negative light, of which she is one. So take your pick. But at this point, Durham, his investigative team, has made no comment, and the original email said nothing about her reasons. She just sent a parting email to the people she's been working with. Hey, I'll be leaving my job so-and-so on such and such a date. Been a pleasure working with you all. Good luck. See ya. That's really it. She made no complaint in her email. So that's why I don't know if we should believe it or not. And I don't think it's all that relevant anyway. Now, another very, very important story that broke, which still is not getting much attention, was broken by, again, a great reporter, Eric Felton, who writes this particular story, appeared in Real Clear Investigations. Real Clear Investigations. And what he's reporting on is the transcript from the interview that was conducted with Michael Gaeta, Steele's handler, Christopher Steele's handler in Rome. He is the agent who Steele first went to back in the summer of 2016 and first began telling him about this so-called Trump-Russia collusion stuff. Now, this testimony was given almost a year ago to the Senate Intelligence Committee, who just released the reports. And he was one of the interviews they conducted almost a year ago. So let's go through some of the things that they learn from Michael Gaeta, Steele's handler in Rome. And keep in mind, Michael Gaeta is very close personal friends with Stephen Soma, who's on the Crossfire Hurricane team working in New York. They worked for years together in New York. And so Michael Gaeta, according to the transcripts, throws Steele under the bus, along with Peter's been stroking us, Bill Priestap, and the entire Crossfire Hurricane team. So Michael Gaeta throws them under the bus in his testimony. Let's go through some of the things he told them in that testimony. He describes, in his testimony, Christopher Steele as crazy and as the craziest source he has handled in 20 years. He tells the Senate Intelligence Committee that, oh, and keep in mind, Gaeta was also the person who was responsible for making those payments, of which we know there were 13 payments made to Christopher Steele. And we know that the first two meetings that Christopher Steele did with Gaeta, first with Gaeta, then with Gaeta and some other FBI officials later in October, two meetings, one in July, one in October, we know that Gaeta says that Steele was paid $15,000 for each of those meetings. $15,000 for each of those two meetings. So Gaeta was responsible for paying Steele as his handler, but he was also responsible for making sure that Steele did not violate the rules on confidentiality, which he eventually did. So Gaeta then talks about how his relationship with Steele ended and how he was terminated. And he tells the story of how he saw this story in Mother Jones, the article by Mother Jones, which was titled, quote, "A veteran spy has given the FBI information alleging a Russian operation to cultivate Donald Trump." So Gaeta sees this story and he goes ballistic because he knows that someone, and almost certainly it was Steele, who would have given this information to Mother Jones. So Gaeta contacts Steele, has a meeting with him, and of course Gaeta is furious with Steele. And at that point he confronts Steele, and Steele of course admits that yes, he was the source for Mother Jones. Then Gaeta says, "What the hell did you do that for? Was it just about the fact that we haven't gotten your payments to you yet?" Because at that point Steele had met with him twice and they still hadn't made those two $15,000 payments to him. So Gaeta's like, what, is it just the money? Because if it's just the money, I can get you more money, but what you can't do as a source is you can't go, giving this confidential information to news outlets who then write stories like this. But at that point, then Steele, he says, goes ballistic. And he says Steele goes off in this crazy rant about how the FBI opened this investigation into the Right Reverend Clinton's emails. And that he's totally unhinged. At that point, Gaeta says he realizes that Steele's real motivation is actually to help the Right Reverend Clinton and to stop Trump from being elected, which creates a big problem in his mind as a handler. So at that point, Gaeta testifies that he was shocked to the point of disbelief at Steele's crazy rant and his outburst and what he said. At which point, Gaeta picks up the phone and calls Bill Priestap. He tells Priestap about what just occurred, and then Priestap tells Gaeta to close Christopher Steele as a source. That and Steele was then removed and officially on November 17th of 2016 as a source by Gaeta. November 17th of 2016, Gaeta closes Steele as a source as directed by Priestap. Now, despite this, Comey, after this goes down, Comey contacts Clapper and tells him that they are going to use Steele's reports in the intelligence community assessment and that they regard Steele as a credible person. Now, Priestap was copied on this Comey email, but apparently said nothing to Comey, or maybe he did, and we just don't know. Now, not only does Priestap not challenge Comey on using Steele's garbage for the ICA, Priestap actually continues receiving Christopher Steele's reports, which he was getting from General Counsel James Baker, Comey's personal lawyer. And he was getting them from longtime friend and reporter of Mother Jones, David Corn. David Corn is feeding Steele's information to James Baker, General Counsel Baker, Comey's lawyer, and he is feeding it now to Priestap, despite the fact that Priestap has already ordered Gaeta to fire Steele, which he did. According to Gaeta, he did file the paperwork to end his relations with Steele as an informant. So essentially, Priestap was using a back channel. even though he knew Steele had been blown up. Now, this also created another problem for Priestap and Comey, because now they had officially terminated Steele as a source. So what they had to do now was to try and cover their ass. And that's why in 2017, months later in 2017, when they realized that the heat is on and Trump has won the election and they now have to cover their ass, that's why Priestap and Peter's been stroking us take a trip to London, specifically to try to find anyone who can vouch for Steele, so that they can now say, well, we had some other people told us Steele was solid. So they needed to find some people to tell them that Steele was solid, to cover their ass from what they did several months earlier by firing, 2 months earlier, firing Steele. So they fire Steele, but they're still using his information. They're also quite aware that Steele was also feeding Bruce Orr through a back channel, who was feeding it then to his handler, who was FBI Crossfire Hurricane team member Joe Pientka. So Priestap's getting it back channeled to him, even though Steele's been blown up. Crossfire Hurricane team Pientka is getting it back channeled to him through Bruce Orr. So they continue getting Steele's stuff through back channels, even though they've already blown him up. This is why in January of 2017 they had to do cover your ass stuff. They had to go interview Iggy. They had to go interview to try to cover their ass there. They had to interview Papagalopoulos. Had never interviewed Papagalopoulos until January 2017. They had to interview Misfit January 2017. They had to go over to London and try to do something, and that was basically the day after they opened Crossfire Hurricane, because they know that that Steele is basically compromised. So that's why Strzok and Priestap went over to London, was to try to find someone who would say something good about Steele, because they knew that he was basically a bad apple, and they'd known that from Pientka, from his handler, which was Gaeta. So there you go. This is all very, very clear. I mean, it's very, very clear what all went on here, and none of this should surprise us, but this is new information. But I would think that this is very, very bad news for both Priestap and Comey. It shows that both Priestap and Comey were well aware of Steele being blown up and what his real purpose was and how his stuff wasn't credible. Yet they continued using him after that, using two different back channels. One Priestap was using, and one the Crossfire Hurricane team was using, to continue to use Steele's stuff, even though they knew he was bullshit and that his material was bullshit. They had already interviewed his source at this point. So, anyway, that is pretty much the long and short of it. Now, we also had Peter's been stroking us doing a couple of news interviews where he completely throws the dossier and Christopher Steele under the bus, and even tells ABC in an interview, yeah, well, the dossier turned out to be bullshit, and we chased it around for months and months, wasted our time, it was total bullshit. So what you have here now is Peter's been stroking us, just as I told you months ago. I told you the FBI would throw Steele under the bus. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're going to throw Steele under the bus and try to make him the scapegoat. But I'm telling you, just as I told you months ago, Christopher Steele knows a lot of things. He's not just going to be scapegoated. And I'm telling you, Christopher Steele is now going to throw them under the bus. And this is how this whole thing is going to unravel. Because Steele knows a lot of things that he's not even talked about yet. He hasn't wanted to talk to Durham. Well, now that Peter's been stroking us, and the FBI and everyone else is going to throw him under the bus, he may decide, on his own defense, to talk to Durham. And he'll probably spill his guts in some sort of a plea deal. There you go. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be back next time there's some news. Thank you. Bye.